Let me welcome our third introducer, Andrea Alvarez, who's going to introduce our speaker. I hope Andrea is here. Yes, there you go.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Andrea Alvarez, and I am a MA PhD student at the Department of Art History in Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. It is with pleasure that I introduce you to our next guest speaker, Dr. Antonio Vallejo Triano. Dr. Vallejo Triano is a curator of cultural heritage for the Junta de Andalucía and director of the archaeological site of Madinat el Zahra. He is also director of the journal Cuadernos de Madinat el Zahra and is on the editorial staff for Arqueología y Territorio Medieval. A prolific writer, Vallejo Triano has authored many books and articles. Most recently, La Ciudad Califal de Madinat el Zahra, Arqueología de su Arquitectura, in 2010. Dr. Vallejo Triano received his PhD in Humanities from the Universidad de Jaén in Spain and has since worked in many Andalusian archaeological sites. Dr. Vallejo Triano, his topic for today is the architectural decoration of Al-Andalus. Please join me in welcoming Antonio Vallejo Triano.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this presentation. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the symposium, Sheila Blair and Jonathan Bloom, for kindly inviting me to explain here in this extraordinary museum some questions concerning the capitals and the decoration of the Umayyad Caliphate, and also the responsibles of the museum for allowing me the access to the materials. The Umayyad Caliphate of Al-Andalus represents one of the peaks of Islamic civilization in the Mediterranean basin in the 10th century. Amongst the most important aspects of its extraordinary artistic production arise the architectural decoration developed within its buildings, which shows a clear superiority both in quantity and quality over other contemporary stage productions. Support elements from this architecture, cimetière, capitals, shafts, and column bases, provide one of the most characterized elements of this architectural decoration. Amongst them, the capitals constitute the most relevant compilation for their prominence and visibility in the decorative program collection, for their ornamental treatment, and also as they were used on some occasions as a support to offer precise institutional information about the patron, the chronology, and other organizational aspects of the caliphal state. The city of Madinat al-Zahra, built close to Cordoba by the first caliph of Al-Andalus after Rahman III, after Rahman al-Nasir in 1936, was, from its origins, the main center of reception, re-elaboration, and diffusion of architectural and artistic shapes created by the Umayyad Caliphate. Along with the other elements of the material production, the capitals experience an elaboration and selection process from a diversity of models coming from the previous period, until the two main morphological types developed in this period were defined, that is, the composite order capital and the Corinthian derived style. It was in the hall of Abderrahman III, there, the main political reception hall during the Caliphate, where these two types of capitals acquire their more canonical features, characterized by the cubical proportion of the block, the cylindrical shape of the basket, and the development of a deep curving type made with a trifine. The two capitals of the Museum of Doha shown in this presentation represent the two great morphological types already mentioned. The first one is characterized by the cylindrical form of the basket, with an 8-leaf crown of acanthus of 4 fingers, a little stem with the shape of a chain between the leaves of the upper layer, which end in a little flower, and a classical bead decoration with ovals and double pearls. The equine is arranged in the shape of a quarter of a circle. The big angular volutes are discoidal. The abacus has 2 starger levels, the upper one being flat, and the gassets centered in the axis of each one of the 4 fronts adopt a prismatic shape, one of them with an epigraphical inscription. The leaves of acanthus of the calathos are structured with thick stems, which create a clear division with the thin fingers of a thorny aspect located on both sides and fan-shaped. The stems are flat, and they are decorated with a longitudinal floating, unlike the braided and trifine decorations which were usually adopted in the capitals of the hall of Abderrahman III, on the right. They resemble, by contrast, in the classical bead decoration formed by oval forms and pair of discs of pearls, and in the secondary stem in the shape of a chain. The equine adopts the form of a crown composed of leaves in the shape of a calyx, which alternate with stem and double leaves of 3 fingers linked with 2 little flowers. Except the epigraph, the 3 remaining placards show a mesh of intertwined stems in a diagonal shape. The volutes are formed by a scroll of leaves, which surround a 6-petal little flower in the center. The edges show a deep plant decoration of trifine, and the rest on the leaves of the upper body of the calathos with 2 small posts, which imply that the volutes have a total carving, and then the ring that forms the opposite one lies over the entire basket. As a particular shape, it should be pointed out that the capital shows a small box made in place of one of the small volutes of the lowest layer of leaves, in order to fit a similar piece used to replace the damaged element. Some formal and decorative features of this capital, as well as its dimensions, will hypothetically enable it to be related to another model, also of a composite type, which probably belonged to the small pavilion located over the emblematic and monumental entrance to the palace of Madinat al-Zahra, although it also shows some significant difference. The second capital is of the Corinthian-derived style, although it contains some specific features which distinguish it from the more known and stereotyped models, which are also the ones for the whole of the Abderrahman III. In the first place, and unlike most of the models of this type, it shows 2 rows of acanthus leaves, not 3. The upper row has disappeared, partially replaced by a new motif, and in part by a prominent gusset of an inverted triangle shape, with rounded borders which start with a straight and stylized stem sprouting from underneath the upper layer of the leaves of acanthus. A tree fruit can be distinguished in 2 of these gussets, specifically a pine cone, and in the other one a plant composition with a heart shape which resembles an inverted palmette. In second place, the capital shows large cauliculi, which adopt the shape of a thick tree trunk, engraved with floatings and crowned with a small leaf in the form of a calyx. From it, 2 elements emerge: an acanthus branch, whose continuation makes up the circular volute, which ends up coiled up in a prominent curl, and a very well-defined fair leaf with little head-shaped leaves on both sides of the stem, which adopt the shape of an S and which grows the other part of the composition. The volutes are fully curved and only rest on one point of the leaves of the upper layer of the calathos. As in the previous capital, the leaves of acanthus are structured in groups of 4 fingerings, arranged on both sides on the central nerves. These are flat with vertical flutings. One of the 4 faces of the capital is unfinished. Its different parts have only been carved in broad strokes without reducing the decorative details. This shows that probably that part of the capital remained hidden, and therefore it was located against the wall. This capital might be related to a series of models, also a Corinthian-derived style, which are characterized by the presence of fair leaves, as if they were breads, sprouting at the level of the volutes of the second row of the acanthus leaves, crossing over it and ending up under the gusset. They sometimes coil up over them, simulating a third volute. With this general type, we can identify a collection of capitals, all of which are different due to the morphology of the palm leaves. This double breadth of fair leaves of a snake-shaped design, which represent the most unique feature of this series, is not present in any of the capitals of the whole of the Abderrahman III. Although, without a doubt, it comes from the collection of vegetal models introduced into that building. In particular, this arrangement is verified in the decorative boards of stone of the exterior facade of the hall, which at the moment is in a stage of investigation and assembly. There, the intertwined palm tree leaves emerge from the calyx and finish off the trunk of the central tree, which organizes the entire collection and helps to form the top of the tree. Despite this layout, the general appearance of the capital of Doha is of greater classicism, with elements such as the triangular shape of the gusset or the large cauliculi, which have a more similar appearance to the classical models. The extraordinary quantity and wide variety of these capitals makes us think of 3 essential questions. Firstly, the knowledge of the architectural context. Secondly, the features related to its making and to its patrons. And finally, that which concerns the reference of inspiration of these pieces. During the 8th and 9th century, the Mosque of Córdoba was, along with some small quarter mosques, the only basilica-type structure which required a large amount of column supports, and therefore of capitals. There. As we know, after a first stage of reusing capitals from pre-existing buildings, Roman, late antiquity, and Visigoth, in the 9th century, the first Islamic capitals were defined. But it was during the 10th century, with the Caliphate, when an extraordinary increase in the production of capitals took place, which cannot be compared to the number of manufactured pieces in any other Islamic, Mediterranean, or Oriental state, as Patrice Cressier has proved. Suffice it to point out that, to give an idea, the number of capitals with the excavated buildings contained until then in Madinat al-Zara included 260 pieces, an extremely large number when we compare it to the small surface excavated in the city, which is around 10%. If we leave aside the 2 types specifically created for the religious architecture, to the Caliphate, first for the Mosque of Madinat al-Thara on the left, and after that for the Caliphal extensions of the Mosque of Cordoba on the right, this wide variety and richness of types and models are due to the extraordinary architectural development based on the arch produced about the middle of the 10th century in Al-Andalus. This proliferation of caliphal capitals is due to two factors. Firstly, there was the introduction and development of the three arches series in the private residential area. This type of series of arches appeared for the first time in the most important buildings of Madinat al-Thara. First, in the so-called pool house, which we identify with the residence of the Caliph al-Hakam II, later in the house of the Hajib Jafar ibn Abderrahman, and finally in a late alteration made in the Caliphal residence, which we know as Dar al-Mulk. From there, it spread to the private residence of the ruling elite. And secondly, and in a much more significant way, the multiplicity of caliphal capitals is due to the introduction and development to the first time in Al-Andalus of basilica-type architecture in the civil and palatial context of Medina Zara, not in a religious context where it already existed in the past and which will continue to be the reference of the new caliphal mosques. This type of basilica building became the main model for the representation of power during the caliphate. Although its precedents are found in the basilica architecture of the mosque, in reality it does not constitute the copy of any pre-existing building in the Eastern Umayyad world or in the Abbasid or Fatimid architecture. The models does not seem to derive exclusively from the characteristic type of inverted T of the Abbasid architecture, because this type does not really explain sufficiently anything that has to do with the protocol or the action taken in the interior. In fact, the building seems to be formed from a strictly basilica-type core of 3 aisles with a forward portico, to which a collection of perimeter halls are added, finally creating a U-shaped circulation space belt around the above-mentioned core. The main function of this belt was to provide exclusive access to the audience area itself to the different groups that participate in the ceremonies: the Caliph, his family, the groups of high-ranked civil servants, and the members of the embassies. The process of the scene composition, the activities and positioning protocol are well described by the Caliphal chronicles, Isa al-Razi, and have been studied. We should remember that the lateral eastern access was exclusive to the Caliph because of its direct relation to the residential layout of the rooms joined to the meshli, from where the sovereign would appear. The western lateral access, by contrast, might have been used by the Caliph family and the different bodies of government employees which made up the elite of the administration of the Caliphal state. The extraordinary artistic quality of the decorative marble pilasters which flanked these doors confirms this use. Finally, the embassies must have had access to the interior of the building via the facade and the transversal aisle. Here, there is a triple foundational inscription of a monumental nature with the name of the Caliph, Abdurrahman al-Nasir, allocated as the patron of the building, and Abdallah ben Bar and Sunaif as the directors of the work. The architectural decoration, as well as the remaining culture material, was one of the most important means, if not the main one, of legitimate expression and propaganda of the Caliphal state and of its ruler. Therefore, and on the par with the architecture, the decorative programs were the object of similar planning processes: choice of theme and ornamental design, supervision, implementation, and control. All of these require a complex organizational and material structure of workshops. Generally, these panels were arranged in horizontal rows of different heights, and on their surface, the composition was drawn first and then curved. This decoration has been the object of investigation and recomposition in several buildings, and especially in the Hall of Political Receptions, which was ordered to be built by the Caliph Abdurrahman III between the years 953 to 957. Therefore, this is one of the most emblematic and important buildings of all the Caliphal architecture. The decoration is arranged in 3 registers, from which the lower one is composed of an extraordinary collection of more than 60 panels, all of them different and large in size, spread as a plinth through the building. Each of one represents a tree-like structure with roots, trunk, tree top, and branch, which articulate and vertebrate an exuberant plant motifs, of which Christian Eber, its principal specialist, has pointed out the extraordinary richness and variety, identifying more than 1,700 different motifs. These plant motifs start from basic shapes: leaves, fruits, flowers, generally of a close outline, that recall the ornamental elements of Samarra, and that end up generating some very complex decorative structures. It represents a new decorative language of a clear Abbasid influence, which can only have been made by artisan teams coming from the East or trained in an artistic atmosphere directly in contact with the Abbasid world. And in the upper decorative registry, a frieze is laid out with geometric shapes and stars which covers the entire building. All of this decoration, which constitutes the scenery of the Caliphal presence, has been interpreted by Manuel Acien as a cosmography. The plant panels constitute the representation of the wall of Nesha, of the sublunar wall of Aldunia, of the wall of the generation and corruption, while the upper frieze of stars represents the firmament. But there remain places that make up the decoration, such as the different elements of support, capitals, column bases, shafts, and symmetria, and other marble elements, such as pilasters, small decorative arch, panels, were entirely carved through the stage of this production process in a workshop and not in the building. The extraordinary homogeneity represented by each of these collections of pieces, as regards types of materials, carving technique, composition, and decorative selection, within the extraordinary richness and variety of models, as occurred with the capitals, allow us to be sure that all of them have been made in official workshops of Dar al-Sina, House of Trades. The Islamic sources match up when pointing out that this important industrial establishment of the state was located in the interior of Medinat al-Farah, in some part of the lateral areas of the Medina, eastern or western, which are the only ones built. You have here. These workshops not only manufacture the so-called sumptuary objects used in the court, a good example being 2 little ivory boxes which portray in their epigraphs their origin from the Caliphal city, but also produce the different elements of the architectural decoration. This is also confirmed by the content of the messages transmitted, especially in the case of the capitals. although not exclusively, which provide us with invaluable information in which the figure of the Caliph is praised as the patron, with all his formal titles, and which also consigns the name of some overseers of the execution or control, and on some occasions the chronology of its making. We know that in the large friezes and in the abaci of the capitals, after the expression al-Ayadai, the person or officials responsible before the Caliph for the building are named. Such people were in the highest authority or non-technical political leadership of the work. We also know that in the money gazettes and in this specific base, after the expression amal, the name of the supervisor of the workshop or the artisan who carry out the work, a government employee of the Caliphal Dar al-Sina, was allocated. In the case of the composite capital of the Museum of Doha, we have already pointed out that it contains an epigraphic gazette. It shows a text made in austere Kafic, elaborated in relief and arranged in 2 lines, where my colleague Maria Antonia Martinez read, "Work of Durri in Sad." Durri was a well-known name at that time, an important family of slaves, one of whom was called Durri al-Sagir, who was Fatah of Al-Hakam II, and we know that he gave the Caliph the Almunia, or palatial estate, of Al-Rumaniyya as a present, located to the west of Medinat al-Fara. The name of Sad, for its part, is allocated in the epigraphs of several pieces of the whole of Abderrahman III and its annexed rooms, as we have seen in the previous base. In the Gazette of another capital that probably came from Medinat al-Fara, which is found today in a private collection, we can also read in 2 lines the inscription, "Work of Nash in Sad." The Durri in Sad of the capital of Doha is the first that is mentioned in the Andalusi epigraphy, so it has to be added to the list of the ashab and of the artisans linked to the Caliphal Dar al-Sina. The homogeneity which these Caliphal capitals demonstrate within its diversity assure us that most of them were produced by and for the works of the state, and therefore in the official workshop of Dar al-Sina. However, the works of the state were not their only destiny. The elite of the important figures making up the circle of power of the caliphate, as the caliphs themselves, accumulated great fortunes in the undertaking of their tasks. This allowed them to build large privated residences, generally palatial estates, which use models typical of palatial architecture, such as porticos and lounges with tripartite series of arches, and with them they also resorted to main column supports and to capitals. We have been able to find evidence for this on the palatial estate of Al-Rumaniyya in a recent excavation. Al-Rumaniyya has a very big pool and 3 garden levels. The existence of an open room to the pool and the garden was discovered via an archway consisting of 3 arches, as this hypothetical reconstruction shows. The quality and technical level of the decorative remains of these palatial estates remind us of the workshop themselves, which carved the decorative programs of Al-Fara, but it is obvious that the orders were different. The formal and decorative characteristics of the pieces themselves are the ones that reveal to us at least a destination which does not seem to correspond to an official building sponsored by the government. The capitals, for example, get together an animal iconography based on birds and lion heads, to which we are only slightly aware from a volute. which had no tradition in Madinat al-Farah or amongst the representative buildings or residents. The resources of this iconography are also verified in other marble pieces, such as wash basins, where again there appears a collection of animals which is non-existent in the city of Al-Nasir. They also exist a series of capitals, such as the so-called capital of the musicians, which must obey specific orders, and although its iconography corresponds to a theme that is typical of the court, it seems clear that its destiny was not any building of Al-Farah or the Umayyad Palace of Córdoba. These materials reveal, therefore, a more complex reality which is not exclusively restricted to Medinat al-Farah and the official buildings. The proliferation of these palaces of the members of the aristocracy linked to the state, which we know about mainly for writing sources, generated an important request of marble decorative materials, especially support elements, although not exclusively, and also of wash basins and other pieces of which we are little informed. A part of these materials must have been carved in caliphal workshops, which would mean that their production was not restricted to the direct orders of the state or the caliph, but instead that these workshops and artisans also supplied a commercial circuit restricted to the management elite and unconnected to the caliphal sponsorship. The expression blessing from God to its owner itself, which some Gazette register, has been related to that market and those clients who use them not only in palaces but also in the construction of some mosques, which were sponsored by this elite as pious works. In this case, we may well wonder if the state controlled the hypothetical commercialization and selling of these productions, or if it received taxes or benefits from this activity of some kind. But the demand of these materials was so great that they might have suggested local non-official workshops located in Madinat al-Farah or in Córdoba itself in order to satisfy this need. This also seems to be confirmed in some pieces of architectural decoration, such as in one of the panels of Al-Rumaniyya, whose plant composition and motifs are similar to the other pieces at the residence, but whose different technical quality place it in a productive circuit unconnected to the official workshop. With regard to the reference of inspiration for the architectural decoration of the Caliphate, influences that are mainly from the Byzantine, Umayyad, and Abbasid world have been identified. For the capitals, it has also been pointed out that the elements were influenced by diverse and complementary traditions, in this case also classical, and the selection of them entails, needless to say, implication not only of aesthetic characteristic, but also of political and propaganda fishes. It is known that from the moment of their first concession for the Mosque of Córdoba of Abderrahman II, the Islamic capitals took as inspirational models or copied directly classical Roman capitals, although from the very start they established difference regarding dimensional systems. The changes and transformations made to the classical models as far as the definition of archetypes of the caliphal capital have been referred to by various authors, amongst them my colleague Patrice Cressier. The composite capital ended up acquiring a very relevant role in the architecture of Abderrahman III period, and it was in the reception hall of this caliph where this capital acquired its most canonical model and which will maintain a great formal stability in the second half of the 10th century. The capital of the Museum of Doha, on your left, adjusts to this model regarding its proportion and its formal and aesthetic organization. Its chronology should be placed, therefore, between the years 953 and 960, which is also the chronology of the capital of the pavilion over the portico. In contrast with the previous one, the Corinthian capital shows an extraordinary wealth of decorative formulae and variants, which go beyond the models present in the rich hall, in the hall of Abderrahman III. Some of these subtypos use elements of the previous or classical tradition, as occurred with the Corinthian capital on this Museum of Doha, where we have seen the large cauliculi and the triangular gazette. However, this use may not be appreciated with chronological criteria of antiquity in relation to other Corinthian capitals which do not use these elements. In fact, for several reasons, this capital should hypothetically correspond to the beginning of the Caliphate of Al-Hakam II. As in the rest of the architectural decoration, this use of recovery of elements from the last tradition should not be interpreted exclusively as a product of artistic evolution, but in terms of decisions and choice of an appropriate ornamental program for each building. I will give an example. In Medina Zara, at the same chronological moment in which the models of Caliphal capital were being consolidated in the throne hall, in the hall of Abderrahman III, all models were being copied for other different buildings of the palace. The excavation have shed light on a capital of an extraordinary classicism that, in spite of its dilapidated state, we are able to recognize that this practically constitutes a copy of the emerald capital of Abderrahman II in the Mosque of Cordoba, as is known, were transported and placed in the mihrab of the Caliph Al-Hakam II. The morphology of the large cauliculi and the existence of the large upper spirals, which do not appear in the Caliphal capitals, are elements that are practically identical in both pieces. These are only distinguished by their acanthus leaves and in the triangular, not circular shape of the gazette. This capital must now be related to a column basis whose morphology features differ from the models that are typical of the Caliphate and result in a more or less exact copy of the column base of the mentioned mihrab. The origin building of both elements is a hall which is scarcely unknown, not having been excavated, but from which we know that it's located at the foot of the Caliphal residence and has double supports in its jambs, hence the name of double column hall for which it is known. All this confirms that in this building and from those materials used, a conscious relation was sought with the period of Abderrahman II via the architecture, which at that moment best identified the continuity of the Umayyad dynasty, which was the mihrab of the corresponding mosque to the extension of that emir. This use of elements and classical models as one of the sources of inspiration of the Caliphate is well documented, and we find its most emphatic evidence in the mihrab of the Mosque of Cordoba, especially in the interior cornice, which copies a Roman motif with metops over a bead decoration, even though it introduced some plant elements which are entirely Islamic and that come from the Abbasid tradition already present in the hall of Abderrahman III of Madinat al-Farah and the Al-Hammam Mosque itself. There also exist other materials from Madinat al-Farah that use, maintain, or copy motifs of the previous tradition. I refer to a collection of cematia which come from a cematia of which, at some moment, there were doubts about whether the materials were reused. These cematia are decorated with different motifs such as ropes, playing of spikes, intersecting circles, series of stars like squares, and classical bead decorations. Now we can clearly state that they are caliphal materials, made ex professo for some palatial buildings, not yet excavated and therefore unknown, where some common elements coming from the preceding local tradition were used. These elements were re-elaborated to be used in a type of piece which, like cimetio, were inexistent in the classical period. How can we explain this use and re-elaboration of previous materials? As is known, this topic has been the object of discussion in recent years, and probably there is not just one single explanation for this phenomenon. In the case of capitals and classicistic column bases of the so-called double column hall, the copy of these elements during the Caliphate should be clearly interpreted as a reference to the previous architecture and therefore as the need to establish a testimony of dynastic continuity in this building through these marble materials. In a general sense, the use of previous elements can be explained by the idea of a surpassing integration. In some cases, this surpassing integration means the use of the works of the past as a reference and as a model of inspiration in order to create new objects, both beautiful and functionally efficient. But in other cases, it means to appropriate directly of those elements, reusing them with a new function and within a new context. This occurs with the extraordinary collection of more than 20 figurative Roman sarcophagi of a different theme and size, which were introduced into the palatial buildings of Medina Alfara, together with diverse Roman portraits and other elements from that culture. It is worthwhile mentioning the sarcophagus of the hunting thing of Meleagro and the wild boar of Calydon, or this one of the deceased at the gate of Hades, or the fragments or a one-to-one scale of muses and philosophers, or this fragment of a pastoral scene, or portraits such as this female, and sculptures such as of Hermes with the lion, which is a fountain. The sarcophagi in particular form one of the most important collections of these elements in the Iberian Peninsula, both for quantity and quality. All of these were reused as wash basins and were placed in the courtyards of the large administrative buildings of Medina Sara at the same time that the whole of Abderrahman III is being constructed with a transcendental artistic contribution coming from the Abbasid world. In both cases, the surpassing integration suggests the use of elements for previous cultures and their integration into one's own, not necessarily as trophies, but rather with the idea of placing oneself at the top and above the governors who created them. This selective routing from the local tradition, which verifies all these materials from Medina Alfara, must be interpreted as a part of a premeditated program that seeks to convey the superiority of Islam over other cultures and the superiority of their leaders. This conception might find certain support in historiography. We know that the Caliphate made an important historiographic project about Al-Andalus, which has not been sufficiently studied up to now. This work was made mainly by the chroniclers of the court of Abderrahman III and Al-Hakam II, the Al-Razi, of which the first one, Ahmad ibn Muhammad al-Razi, wrote a record, the Akbar Muluk al-Andalus, History of the Kings of Al-Andalus, which has been handed down to us incomplete. This work is, in reality, a history of the Iberian Peninsula, a national story in some ways, not a story of the dynasty of the Umayyads who, for different circumstances, ended up settling in Al-Andalus. As Diego Catalán has pointed out, the history of the Umayyads in Córdoba does not start in the east, in Syria, but with the prehistory of Al-Andalus, with the first settlers of the peninsula. This significance given to the land, to the territory, responds to the conscience of the singularity of the Umayyad Caliphate and its identification with that territory. In other words, after more than 2 centuries from its settling, in the mid-10th century, the governors of the Caliphate had a clear conscience of where they were located, and they present themselves as owners of the territory and therefore as heirs, keepers, and surpassers of previous cultures. In this context of historic re-elaboration which the Caliphate produced to present the Umayyads as legitimate kings of the peninsula, of the Iberia Peninsula, is where an appropriate explanation is found for the use and integration into their palaces and decorative programs of identifying elements from these cultures, which were divested of their original function and put at the service of a new material and ideological purpose. The incorporation of these elements was, therefore, one of the means that Umayyads used in order to legitimate themselves as governors of Al-Andalus. If the decorative program of Al-Hakam II in the Mosque of Córdoba has been interpreted in terms of dynastic legitimacy, in Madinat al-Zahra we can begin to distinguish clearly another type of legitimacy, complementary with the previous one, which would connect the Umayyads to the land they rule over. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Paper was a brilliant example of why we have these in chronological order, because you are seeing the connections to Abbasid Samara. Antonio Vallejo also brought us, Triano also brought our connections back to the classical world, and some of us in the front were struck by the connections to the Romanesque world from the figural capital and on. So you can see how these objects can tell us wonderful and wilder stories. Can I just have the people who are coming, give the people who are coming in another moment to get settled, and then we'll move on to our last speaker of the morning.